Located in the northwest peninsula of the southernmost Caribbean island of Trinidad, the region of Chaguaramas arguably has one of the most diverse historical backgrounds throughout the island. Its mainland and islets cover 12,050 acres and 2,750 acres respectively. These islets are located both south and west of the peninsula. To the south are the 5 islands, namely Lenigan, Caledonia, Pelican, and Rock. Apart from the 5 islands, there are also the Diego Islands, Carrera, and Kronstadt. To the west of the peninsula are the islets of Gaspar Grande, Monos, Huevos, Patos, and Shakashakari. Throughout its history, Chaguaramas has been a staging ground for many significant world events dating from the time of the Amerindians to the Anglo-Spanish War to World War II and much more. The history of Chaguaramas as we know it begins with the first peoples, the Amerindians. Chaguaramas, which is Arawak for the palms, was named for the numerous palm trees that lined Chaguaramas Bay. After discovering Trinidad in 1948, Christopher Columbus skirted the islets, seeking a route out of the Gulf of Paria. Fearing wrecking his ships on reefs, he returned to the mainland. A friendly cacique advised him to be patient and watch the tide before setting out. Taking heed of the advice, Columbus successfully sailed out the Gulf and was well on his way. The arrival of the Spanish drove the Amerindian population almost to extinction, and for years the only people to be found in the region were pirates just off the south of Gaspar Grande Island. In the 18th century, Chaguaramas once again was the staging ground for world history. Spain and Britain were at war. The Spanish admiral, Don Sebastian Ruiz de Apodaca, sailed into the Gulf of Paria with 5 ships and was directed to anchor in Chaguaramas. On February 16, 1897, 18 British ships under the command of Sir Ralph Abercrombie entered the Gulf with a sole mission, the capture of Trinidad. Outmanned, outnumbered, and outgunned, the Spanish admiral ordered the crew to set the ships on fire and head for land. The battle was over before a single shot was fired. Chacon had no choice but to capitulate, and the British took control of the island without a single casualty. In 1813, the peninsula would again play a part in the ousting of the Spanish. Santiago de Marino, a Venezuelan revolutionist with estates on Shakashakari, along with other influential individuals, pooled resources to raise a force of independence fighters to storm Venezuela in order to free it from the Spanish Empire. When the day of the invasion came, only 45 fighters still had the courage to follow through, the majority taking their $4 advance and turning tail. Lack of numbers did not deter the 45 strong-willed fighters. Armed with 5 muskets and few cutlasses, they set off for Venezuela in 2 open boats. Against all odds, they quickly captured the town of Guerilla. Their army grew with the liberation of every town and earned them the nickname of the Immortal 45, their efforts eventually leading to the ousting of the Spanish. After slavery was over, the plantations languished, and so too the economy of Chaguaramas. This brought about a change in the peninsula. Chaguaramas developed into somewhat of a resort for the rich and wealthy. Getting to Chaguaramas, however, was never easy. A small paddle-wheeled steamer was the main transport at the time, but the ride was unpleasant. It was hot, slow, and the ride was rough. The opening of a motorable road to Tetron Bay brought a new life to the region. Clubs, parking lots, a jetty, and bathhouses were created to facilitate the new influx of vacationers. Then came World War II. Britain and her allies faced the might of Germany and the Axis. The German submarine campaign was being prosecuted with telling effect. Britain's operations had been severely affected, particularly at sea, with the losing of a large number of their destroyers. The United States, not yet in the war, needed sites to build bases to consolidate their defense in the Caribbean. Thus, both countries entered into negotiations which led to the Destroyers for Bases Agreement signed on September 2, 1940. In exchange for 50 overage destroyers, Britain gave the U.S. a 99-year lease on lands in 8 Caribbean islands and in Argentina to facilitate the building of bases. The Chaguaramas area was deemed ideal by the Americans, and by the end of 1941, all the villages in the area were demolished or abandoned to make way for the thousands of American soldiers. The arrival of the Americans also brought the war to the region. The Germans expanded U-boat operations to the Caribbean and began targeting Allied vessels and successfully sank a number of ships in local waters. These activities led the Americans to bolster the defenses and facilities at Chaguaramas. Guns were added, mines were laid, communications improved, and submarine nets were set. After the war, Chaguaramas lost its strategic usefulness, yet still the Americans refused to relinquish control of the peninsula. This refusal would serve as fuel in the fire of another war, the War for Independence. In 1956, the People's National Movement, led by Dr. Eric Williams, won the Trinidad and Tobago general elections. Still being a British colony, the PNM promised to honor all existing international treaties, such as the one between Britain and the United States. Also in development at that time was the Federation of the West Indies, a political union made up of British colonies in the Caribbean, with the intent to gain independence as one. The Federation elected Chaguaramas to be their headquarters, which backed Williams into a corner. The U.S. was unwilling to compromise, and the U.K. supported them. A commission appointed by the conference declared the issue closed, and Grantley Adams of Barbados, the leader of the West Indian Federation, agreed with the outcome. Williams declared war on them all. On April 22, 1960, a rally was held in Woodford Square. Tens of thousands flooded the streets. Despite the pouring rain, they left the square and marched on the U.S. consulate with a list of their demands. The march was a success, and by the end of 1960, a settlement was reached between the U.S. and Trinidad and Tobago. The war for Chaguaramas ended in a victory for Trinidad and Tobago, and the British were forced to concede full self-government in 1961 and independence in 1962. The U.S. abandoned the base, but American facilities remained under their control until 1977, for which they compensated the Trinidad and Tobago government by means of assistance in various projects. While the peninsula itself has a wealth of history, the islets in the region also have lots to share themselves. The 5 islands were generally used for recreational activities throughout their history, but they all have their own stories to tell. Nelson Island, the island with the most historical significance of the 5 islands, was used as the port of entry for indentured Indian immigrants. Those deemed healthy stayed on the island till they were assigned to estates to work, while the sick were quarantined. The island was also used as an internment camp during World War II for any person in Trinidad with an Austrian or German passport. During the war, the government also had the labor leader Tubal Uriah Buzz Butler interned there, as they saw him as a danger to the state during the conflict. In the 70s, the island was once again used as an internment camp for Black Power activists who the government feared would incite unrest in the country. Linigan was used as an isolation hospital for the indentured laborers with contagious diseases. Rock Island was and still is used as a quarantine for passengers arriving on ships visiting Trinidad. Pelican and Craig were mainly used as holiday resorts, with families renting out accommodations on the islands. Caledonia, the largest of the 5 islands, was always seen as the most esteemed of the 5, and only the most privileged were allowed to rent it. It originally served as the quarters for the medical officer in charge of the quarantine islands. Prior to this, it was used by Lord Harris, who would soon become governor of Trinidad and Tobago, for his honeymoon. On November 13, 1957, the island would once again open its doors to romance as the site for the then-secret marriage of Dr. Eric Williams and Dr. Maylene Muksang. To the west of the five islands lie the Diego Islands, Carrera and Kronstadt. Carrera, originally called Long Island, was leased to a shipping agent in Port of Spain, from which the island got its name. He used the island as a holiday resort and as a quarry for limestone. The quarrying continued in the 1870s when the island was established as a prison depot. In 1875, crime was on the rise and there were 12 escapes from the prison. Transforming Carrera into a penal settlement was deemed to be the solution to the problem. It was designed to punish criminals so harshly that they would never want to return. Carrera has transformed over the years and is now more of a correctional facility than a penal colony. Kronstadt, the other Diego island, started off as an island for rent or lease for pleasure purposes. It was then used as the residence of the prison doctor of Carrera Island. In 1915, the doctor was no longer kept on Kronstadt, and the western part of the island was kept for quarrying. In 1920, the government desired to open a leprosarium at Shakashakari, as the affliction was thought to be contagious in those times. They negotiated a deal with the Roman Catholic Church, which had substantial lands on Shakashakari. That would give the government the land needed on Shakashakari, and the church would get lands on Kronstadt under a 999-year lease. Government regained control of that part of Kronstadt in 1946, and it became a resort used by successive governors of the country. Sir Ellis Clark was the last to make use of the residence, as he deemed it unsafe due to the explosions from the nearby quarry. Gaspar Grandi was granted to Gaspar de Persain-Larocque in 1783. It was cleared and used entirely for cultivating cotton. The Second World War saw the Americans adding guns to the island as part of their base defenses against any German intrusion. But Gaspari is mostly known for its caves. Some of these caves were occupied by vampire bats, but they have since been eradicated.
Trinidad is my land, and of it I am proud and glad. But I can't understand why some people just talk it bad. But I know all of them we running them out. Don't know where they're talking about. They would paint your black every day, and the right things they would never say.
Monos Island gets its name from the Spanish word for monkey. The influx of French settlers in the 1770s to Monos saw the establishment of cotton plantations. After slavery, fishing was the general source of income on the island. The introduction of a permanent steamer service to the island increased its popularity. Holiday homes began popping up throughout the island and is today probably the most visited of the islands for recreational use. Huevos Island literally translates to Egg Island. It is said to be named after the eggs of all the turtles that nest on its beaches. Uninhabited by the Spanish until the 1790s, the island's steep slopes and lack of water made settlement difficult. It was eventually settled as a cotton plantation, then later rented out for vacation purposes. In 1927, the entire island was leased to the Booth family, who was still in possession of the island and making it the only private island. Patos, ducks in English, is also known as Cactus Island, and is the only island in the group that no longer belongs to Trinidad and Tobago. Once Venezuela gained independence, it saw Patos as belonging to their state, as it is geographically closer to their mainland. The British quickly installed a watchman on the island whose main duty was to raise and lower the Union Jack, ensuring Venezuela would not invade. The British eventually gave up the island to Venezuela in 1942 as World War II was underway. This freed up the Gulf of Paria for much-needed oil exploration during the time of war. Shakashakari Shakashakari, the largest of all the islands. Cotton was also the main crop on this island after plantations were established. In 1915, a medical conference declared leprosy to be contagious and that patients should be quarantined. The authorities chose Shakashakari as an appropriate site to isolate lepers from the general public. Eviction notices were sent to the residents of Shakashakari. This angered the general public, but the government continued their plan. By the end of 1926, all patients suffering from leprosy had been transferred to the island. The size of the settlement was large-scale. There were separate settlements for men and women, a convent, a cinema, a Hindu temple, roads, churches, a hospital, a laundry, a doctor's quarters, and a power station. Nuns were headquartered on the island just to tend to the patients, some of the nuns even staying till the end of their lives. The leprosarium was eventually closed as the cases of leprosy dwindled and the cost of operating the settlement grew. Virtually abandoned now, the forest has reclaimed the establishments on the island, destroying most of the buildings in the process. In 1972, the government established the Chaguaramas Development Authority. One of the tasks appointed to the CDA was to develop the region while preserving its ecosystem. Since its establishment, the area has seen vast improvements as well as renovations. Restaurants and places for events and parties have also been established. The most significant improvement to date is the addition of a boardwalk to the popular Williams Bay area. The boardwalk is so far in its first phase, and 2 additional phases are planned. Chaguaramas' beauty and colorful history is part of what makes Trinidad and Tobago unique. From the Amerindians to the Spanish, to the British, then the Americans, then to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. The peninsula has stood the test of time, serving as a rallying point in the nation's fight for freedom and a symbol of strength for the future.